Hello and welcome to Size of Thoughts, conversations with the Alliance of History graduate students. My name is Jacob Glicklick. I'm the producer of the show. The things you will hear over the next hour represent the views of Size of Thoughts and the people making them. All opinions and quotations in no way represent River West Radio. They are the sole responsibility of the producer, guests, and callers. River West Radio is not liable for any legal issues arising from the content of this program. So again, thanks for tuning in, either live or in the archive, and I'm joined tonight by Jennifer Picard.
Hello.
A graduate student from anthropology, to come to have in our famous cross-disciplinary dialogue that can, in terms of hopefully, as I was saying before, like expand some of the, in terms of crazy anarchist rantings, or at least considerations of other kinds of political alternatives and scope of history, like beyond what I think would normally be involved with in history discussions, and beyond which I've ever sort of really grappled with either in teaching or research. So I guess in that blend, I was sort of hoping that this could be a more sort of a just like a conversation or interrogate about research type one, as opposed to extended or bitterly divisive debate. That will happen next week when
we do get bitterly divisive in anthropology, but usually it doesn't relate modern politics very much.
True, and I guess in the kind of the fact that don't have the grounding to in terms of or context, like in terms of dispute or anything you're saying, I think would limit most of the frame. Unlike next week, when as part of election coverage, we'll be debating with another graduate student in history about electoral reform and whether it's viable and achievements or lack thereof of Obama presidency. So
this should be very different from that.
But yeah, but in that, I guess one day I'm going to ask you partly, in context of own in terms of specific research or other things that are kind of just like would be common knowledge in anthropology, but are necessarily beyond that, in the context of studying like prehistory of Wisconsin.
Sure. Well, it's really, I think it's unfortunate that a lot of the education that we receive about American history in general and Wisconsin history in specific doesn't really focus on anything related to the pre-Columbian occupation of this land. And there's actually quite an extensive occupational history beginning pre-Clovis, about 15,000 BC, as you would commonly refer to it, perhaps even earlier than that down at the southern tip of South America, perhaps 30,000 years ago. We had humans in what we somehow refer to as the New World. And my particular research interest focuses on late prehistory, about 1,000 years ago, in a society that was really centered around the American Bottom in Illinois, the most famous site being Cahokia. The height of its occupation was about 81,000 to 1250, and it had a population of about 10,000 people, about 100 mounds, one of which is the very large earthen pyramid known as Monk's Mound, and it's huge. It's the third largest pyramid in the Americas after the Pyramid of the Sun and the Moon in Mexico, and it is a vast site, and it was surrounded by satellite sites throughout the American Bottom in Illinois, and also affected communities throughout the Midwest and the eastern United States throughout time. There are Mississippian sites in Texas, and there are Mississippian sites in Wisconsin. The most famous one in Wisconsin dates to about the same time as the one at Cahokia in Illinois, but a little bit later, perhaps. Well, it was already occupied by a local group called the Late Woodland Society, and the Late Woodland dated from about 8,500 to 81,000. They were growing a suite of native crop plants that I'll talk about later. They built effigy mounds, which you've probably heard of if you live in Wisconsin. They're shaped like animals or just round, sometimes linear designs. And so they were living in this area, and then residents of Cahokia came north to the site of Aztalan, built a huge palisade wall. It's the most heavily fortified city in the pre-Columbian Americas, and apparently did a lot of fighting and grew some corn, so that's my area of interest.
Interesting. And like this pre-Columbian, that story of Wisconsin just not being covered much broadly. I mean, I guess wondering if it could like expand on like I mean, at some level, I guess reasons behind it might be somewhat apparent. I mean, of course, history begins when white people, emerge in an area, but if there's more specific ways that the pre-Columbian legacy gets exercised or bypassed, and also, I mean, what the most, I guess, striking or interesting or impressive parts of the story that aren't being talked about.
There's a couple of reasons for it, and one of them is the big myth of the mound builders issue, which I'll get to in a little bit. But the one really interesting thing that happened, especially in Wisconsin, was obviously Europeans were arriving on the East Coast and in Canada and then traveling through the Great Lakes. And European stuff got to Wisconsin well before Europeans did. So you had metal pots and trade beads, guns, things of that nature getting here. And they were replacing the Aboriginal crafts, essentially the pottery and the lithic tools, because they didn't break as often. They could be traded down the line. They were easier to transport. And so we don't really have that connection between the modern tribes that were living here and the archaeological tribes or groups that we've identified through pottery styles is the only way we can really make these groups. An archaeological culture is just an arbitrary grouping of similar artifact types and subsistence or dietary patterns and settlement patterns. So it's very difficult to make that connection, and so we don't really know which of the living groups in the upper Midwest relates to these archaeological cultures. Also, the living groups in the upper Midwest at the time of European contact had already been shuffled around quite a bit because a lot of groups were pushed westward and then displaced the groups that were actually here. So it's really hard to make that connection. And I think that's part of it. When we talk about the Pilgrims meeting Indians, they're a certain group of Indians that we can't make that connection with archaeologically, and so we skip it. And the other reason, of course, is racism. You want to make it seem like there wasn't much of anything here when we, the Europeans, got here. So there wasn't a civilization. There wasn't, there were just people living in teepees. We have this conflation of all tribes as one entity. You see kitschy gifts with like teepees and totem poles right next to each other, and of course that's completely inaccurate. But we just have this very primitive idea of who the Native Americans were. And I think that generally not teaching about the civilization that was in Illinois prior to European contact sort of helps keep the myth that the Europeans tamed the land and brought it under the plow, when really agriculture was happening here a long time ago, and so on and so forth. So,
yeah, and I guess that doesn't other things, but among other things, I guess to begin or talk to more novices who run through of it. I mean, expand a little bit on for archaeologists in terms of the basis of knowledge or the basis of the kind of dating that has just provided.
Well, I could start with a little bit of the history of the archaeological understanding of these cultures, because I was planning on talking about that. And again, it's archaeology, like any science, is socially embedded, and it's affected by our current political outlook. And when people first started arriving in the Midwest, they saw these earthworks, be they effigy mounds or the platform mounds of the Mississippians, and generally just thought that they could not...
Caller, apparently.
Interesting.
Hello? You on the phone?
With John, and something pops up. It's not my fault.
Hello?
Hello?
Hi?
Hello?
Hello?
Hello, my name is Patty. I'm calling on behalf of Mark Research. We're conducting a research project in conjunction with the University of Wisconsin to examine vaccination rates among families.
Not a call for us. Well, that was an anthropological moment.
Indeed. I thought the point when someone just called in about a month ago and really excited about someone to contribute in discussion of forms of resistance and coming in the state, but it was just someone who had left glasses here and just wanted to see if the sunglasses were still here.
That's pretty funny.
Yep. Anyway.
There were these massive prehistoric earthworks, and the Europeans who were settling the pioneers just really didn't think that their Indians could have built those, the Indians that they were living with, and they came up with all kinds of crazy explanations for it. Some suggested that Vikings built the mounds, Egyptians, because they were pyramids, and only Egyptians could build pyramids, obviously. a lost tribe of Israelites.
Yeah, all that sounds much more plausible than people
Atlanteans.
living around the area.
People actually would like plant tablets with European or Egyptian writing, shallowly in the mounds for people to find, and so they could prove that this was true. And of course, we see this even today with like ancient aliens type stuff, and it's really just like this strange notion that the indigenous people of the Americas couldn't put dirt on top of more dirt to create a monument, which is pretty absurd. And eventually this was debunked. Thomas Jefferson was one of the first people to systematically excavate a mound, to take notes of where he found artifacts and what he was finding, and eventually kind of thought, actually, yes, probably the Native Americans did build this, because I'm finding stuff that, I've seen them use. And also Cyrus Thomas with the Bureau of Ethnology in 1882 used historic accounts to prove that, yes, in fact, Spanish explorers with the De Soto expedition saw Native American groups in the southeast building mounds. So it was documented, just ignored. And modern day archaeology is a very systematic pursuit. And we start out by surveying, like digging a hole every 15 meters and digging and screening the dirt and seeing if we find anything. And then that's where we find the sites, and then we excavate. And what we're looking for really is not shiny stuff like gold, or we're not looking for the coolest artifacts we can find, although we like it when we find it. What we're really looking for is patterns. We look at like the distributional patterns of various kinds of artifacts which are associated with different cultures and the change through time, subsistence practices. I study plant remains or faunal remains and diet, and how that changes through time related to the environment. It's basically like an adaptational type of study in that case. So we look at settlement patterns, we look for features, which are like different colored soil patterns in the ground. They're easier to see than you might think. And in order to get what I study, the floral remains, you take a sample of the soil and you put it through something called a flotation machine, which basically agitates water. You put the soil on top, and the froth keeps any charred floral remains floating. You skim that off, and you can sort through it for seeds and corn, and basically anything that's charred, like wood charcoal or charred maize, doesn't decompose at all. So think about that when you put charcoal in your compost pile. It's not going to break down. We can get charred floral remains from 10,000 years ago. So that's, and you look at it under a microscope and you try to identify it. And basically, modern archaeology is very, very statistically oriented, we have a little bit of physics envy. We want to prove things, but we can't replicate our experiments. So we have to take detailed notes of everything we do, where we found everything. These days we use like GIS to map everything in fairly exactly, and make detailed topographic maps. People will look at the pollen in the dirt to get climate data for the time period. So it's very, very systematic.
And then applying that description and methodology to like sort of study of Wisconsin, or even like specific research that are investigating. What kind of things of it are most interested or excited to find, or that find that most revealing or like data rich?
Sure. Well, the particular site that I work on is called Aztlan. It's located in Jefferson County, near Lake Mills. And Jefferson County was apparently a little bit of an archaeological hotspot. So this is where the people that I talked about earlier from Cahokia, the big city, came up to live with the local late woodland peoples, and sort of built a settlement, erected this palisade wall and these mounds. And they were clearly interacting with other groups in the area and might have been fighting with them. There were other groups, the other late woodland groups, that were building effigy mounds at the time. There are no effigy mounds at Aztlan. And also another group called the Oneota, who were around from about 1,000 years ago until maybe contact, although again, like I said, it's hard to tell, who were also agriculturalists, although a little bit less so. So possibly fighting. And my particular research essentially focuses on a deeply stratified midden at the Aztlan site. And a midden is basically like a trash pit. And this midden was just outside the Palisade Wall, which bordered the Crawfish River, which is a tiny little tributary of the Rock River, more of a creek, really, than a river, and definitely out of the way, interestingly enough. If you were trying to be found by people from Cahokia, that's not where you would go. It's just really out of the way. It's not near any natural resources. And so some people suggest that maybe they were trying to get away from the people at Cahokia for some reason or another. Again, when you start being agricultural, conflict tends to intensify. You tend to start having a greater investment in the land and therefore fighting over it more, whereas foraging peoples tend to just move on. You can always move to another place. You're in smaller groups. Once you invest in the land, you have to fight for it. So it's interesting, at Cahokia there's a mound that dates to about the same time as the Mississippian arrival at Aztalan, where 2 young males are buried in elaborate shell blankets, like woven to be in the shape of what we think are thunderbirds, shell beads, and they're buried with elaborate grave goods, pottery, hundreds upon hundreds of projectile points made of really high quality material, arrowheads we call projectile points because we don't necessarily know that they were attached to arrows. And then in another mound, another burial in that same mound, underneath them are the bodies of 50 young women. Some of whom are decapitated, some of whom were giving birth at the time they were killed. And so it's hard to say exactly what was going on there because we don't like to make assumptions, but I'm going to suggest that possibly that was a sacrificial situation. And Timothy Paquetat and some of his graduate students suggest, and he's a researcher at UIUC down in Urbana-Champaign, suggest that maybe it was a lineage being killed off. So if that sort of thing was going on, you can see why maybe somebody might want to get away from Cahokia if that's happening. So they come up, and basically going back to Aztalan and that midden, that trash pit just outside the riverbank, and this is what's really fascinating about archaeology, is that we want to talk about these great overarching themes and stories, but we end up really, really focused on one tiny little thing, on one particular material culture type. So somebody will study pottery, somebody will study lithic tools, which is stone tools, arrowheads, hide scrapers, that kind of stuff. I study plant remains, and so you get really, really narrow in what you actually do, but when you put what everybody's doing together, it makes sense. It's just that, like, I can't tell you what happened between Aztalan and Cahokia by looking at the plant remains alone, but as part of the larger story, it can contribute. So basically my research, the lowest level of this pit, and it's deeply stratified, which means that there's clear layers in the soil. And according to the law of superposition, what's at the bottom is older than what's on the top. Now, there is a bit of a misconception, and I've had people ask me, like, can you tell how old that is just by looking at it? And unfortunately, no, we can't. Depositional processes are very different site by site. Some places get almost no erosion and no soil formation, so you will have very old material just lying on top. This happens a lot in the desert southwest where there's not a lot of vegetation to decompose. People can find things that are Anasazi, very, very old material just laying on the ground surface. Whereas here, particularly at Aztalan, where there's been a lot of erosion due to farming practices, you have to dig for a good 2 meters before you get to anything that isn't erosional deposits. So just to put that in perspective. And the very bottom layer, anyway, is late woodland. So this is prior to the arrival of the people from Cahokia. And I'm looking at the plant remains from that layer. And then I'm looking at the plant remains from the layer that is mixed, that has Cahokian ceramics and local ceramics in it. And looking if the diet changes, basically, between that time. There's a really common notion that the Mississippians were maize agriculturalists who introduced maize agriculture to other areas, but that's not necessarily the case because I'm finding that there is, in fact, corn in these older deposits, and a lot of it. So I'm going to see what kind of changes basically happen over time, if those are cultural in nature or perhaps environmental in nature. So that's a very specific research question that I'm looking at.
I mean, a few times you've mentioned just like misconceptions or like the assumptions that people have about in terms of either both your trade and like what results that come from it. I guess maybe we would expand on that. I think like the biggest level of like disconnect or or flawed understanding of either what in terms of is involved with for archaeology, what conditions were like before in terms of for indigenous communities, or I mean since I tend to think that a lot of those ones that circulate are not just because people are done with it, but for often kind of more specific cultural reasons. That
sure.
I mean, in one case it seemed like either like the most like just dramatic contrast, or just like the ones where it's the largest difference in terms of what in terms of what actually do and have actually sort of found out, and what the kind of common zeitgeist.
Right. Well, I think that, the biggest misconception, I do get comments about Indiana Jones, and obviously I think most people are aware that it's not like that. It's a lot more meticulous than that. Although, there is this idea that we're always out there with, like, toothbrushes and little tiny dental picks and stuff. And actually, I hate to break it to you, toothbrushes are only for photos. We use shovels most of the time. Trowels to make straight walls at the very end of our work, and occasionally we will use backhoes. For instance, historic cemetery excavations, if they know that the burials are 6 feet deep, then they're not going to bother digging through those top 6 feet where they know there's nothing there.
Well, but there's all the romance gone from it.
So yeah, everything from a toothbrush to a backhoe.
Yeah.
I use tweezers when I do my lab research, but that's a bit different. So you have the big charismatic exhibits like at MPM, the Cleopatra exhibit, or Discovery Channel specials. And in Egypt they do find gold. They find it all the time, but they're still not after the artifact for its monetary value or its. I mean, art historians are interested in it for its looks, or the story that the art factor tells about it. But really, archaeology right now is in pretty much a processual place where everything is really data. Looking at data to try to get at process. So like, not only what are things and what things correspond with what time period, but why and how people did what they did and what we can get at through the material record. One of the best things about archaeology is really we study trash. Things don't end up in the archaeological record unless somebody throws them away. And, with documents, for example, in Egypt, with documents, you have the story of the rich guys, right? You have the pharaoh and the priest, but you don't have the common person. And the neat thing is everybody leaves behind trash. And this is a really good example would be historical archaeology. Archaeologists don't just work on ancient sites where there's no writing. Some of my colleagues work on sites that are very, very recent. One of my professors works on a cemetery that was being used up until the 1930s. But you can actually look at the human remains and get an idea of what the pathology rates. This is the Milwaukee County Institutional Grounds, which is also known as the Poor Farm Cemetery. You can look at disease patterns, and that often was recorded inaccurately in the records. Rates of infant mortality, skeletal wear. You can find out how much work people were doing by looking at the robustness of their muscle attachments on the skeleton. A lot of the females in that collection have a robustness that today would be associated with males because they're just engaged in like hard labor. And so that's an interesting way. You can actually, and with something like that, you can actually sometimes identify the individual using the records and then find out something about their health and about their occupational status by looking at the physical remains. There was a really interesting study done back in the 90s. It was called the Garbage Study, and Milwaukee was one of the cities invited to participate, and it was actually run by some archaeologists. And they would have people fill out a questionnaire about their habits. An example is a question like, how much beer do you drink in a week? And they would reply like, oh, I drink about a 6-pack a week. And then they got these people's permission to go through their garbage. This was like before recycling really took off. And they found out that no, in fact, people drink 2 or 3 6-packs a week. So that's just an example of how looking at the hard material culture data, and not like using it to replace the documents, but to sort of support or refute what's in the documentary history. And unfortunately, even historic archaeologists don't work enough with historians and vice versa. So, and a lot of things people don't like to talk about, like prostitution. Are we getting a call?
Don't think so.
Okay.
That's not us.
Prostitution and gambling, and for example, the rules for the 19th century dormitories at Harvard said, no guns, no liquor, no gambling. And when you excavate the privies, which is where people throw things away that they don't want found, they find liquor bottles, guns, and dice. So it's just, you know, obviously if there's rules written about it, people are doing it. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think and most of the cases cited there, particularly like in terms of reading the difference in like work conditions and professions based on physical evidence from bodies, that seemed kind of like a fascinating way to juxtapose some of, or at least overcome some of the disconnect that happens in studying sort of inequalities and particularly talking more recently. I mean, you can say definite class privileges and class problems of it, which I don't know. It seems like one of the privileges of power, and perhaps the most sustaining, is to have the stories be told about you and simply leave out other people as important, which certainly connects to efforts to delegitimizing or discrediting indigenous people as having possibly the suspicion of that they could have actually built any of the things that are in the areas of which they were inhabiting.
Well, it's really interesting that you bring up the stories being told about you, because another really powerful opportunity with archaeology is to show the agency of the oppressed, I think. Studies on slave plantations, you get the records of what slaves were given as a food ration, and it's pretty meager. It's some corn, maybe a chicken once in a while, very, very meager stuff. But then you look at the midden, at the trash accumulation in the slave quarters, and what you actually find, not always, but a lot of the time, is a lot of game animals. You find deer, wildfowl, fish, things of that nature. And so what we're seeing is slaves essentially breaking the rules and going and hunting to supplement their diets. So they weren't passive victims. I mean, they were definitely victimized, but they weren't, they weren't completely passive. They were trying to do what they could to feed their families and resist what was going on and what was happening to them. So I think, it's that agency that's often lost in the historical narrative.
And related to that, I remember you once told me that indicate archaeological indications of, in terms of with Egypt, that rather than simply just slave exploitation, those indications of some things as like the first strike, basically.
Yeah,
right.
I might have my information slightly wrong on this, but it's in John Rumour's Ancient Lives, if you want to fact check me. That the first strike was recorded among the tomb builders of Ramses II, and essentially they were not slaves. They were it was basically what we call corvée labor, which is a way of paying taxes. So it's not willing labor certainly, but it's not exactly slavery, because most of the year they were free men who worked their own farms and whatnot. And there was just this period of time during the inundation in Egypt during the Nile flood, where there's not a lot of work to do on the farm, and so part of civilization is surplus labor being put toward the use of the elites, and so they were building this tomb, and they were being paid in bread and beer essentially, and they wanted more of it, and they went on strike, and they actually won their demands. So this idea that all of the workers in Egypt thought Pharaoh was God maybe is inaccurate, but that's what the records would suggest. So.
Yeah, and it seems that also there's even more, speaking privately of like the, pop culture study of early agrarian and pre-agrarian societies as this kind of like static, unchanging dystopias of people of leaders and the same kind of leaders able to perpetuate power endlessly, and nothing like really changing or happening like in the context like of the New World, and until the white people showed up, or even in context of societies they didn't until they collapsed. In terms of Egypt was simply a frozen
and not a
picture
dynamic, a structure rather than a process. Really, is what the interpretation is, and certainly. Domestication and agriculture wasn't necessarily a great idea. I mean, you start getting social inequality with that process. Once you have the surplus grain to support an elite, they start trying to get it and trying to get the power. And also, ethnographic studies of hunter-gatherers like the Kung show that they actually have quite a lot of leisure time, and they're in a marginal environment. They've been pushed into a marginal environment. Versus like the Haida of the Northwest Coast, who are in a really rich environment, had 3 months out of the year where they don't have much to do besides party, And so agriculture does create a lot of extra work to do for some people, and allow some people to sit around on their butts doing nothing. But there are definitely misconceptions about agriculture in the so-called New World as well.
Could you better speak to some of the misconceptions of?
Sure. So if I were to ask you what ancient Native Americans ate primarily, what would you likely say?
I was hoping that having the base of this, I would be able to be asking all of the questions and not.
I just, there's no right or wrong here, but just like what your idea is of what Native American agriculture consists of.
Corn.
Sure, corn would be the main one. And you've heard of like the Three Sisters, maybe? No?
No, I haven't actually.
Okay. Well, this is usually like the school interpretation, and even at a lot of, you go visit an archaeological site, and the public interpretation that they have is of this Three Sisters agriculture, maize, beans, and squash. And that these are, and it is a great cropping system. I did it in my garden this year, it worked out very well. But it's this idea that these are what Native Americans grew, and that they're tropical cultigens, that they came to the Americas from to North America from Mesoamerica or even South America, and that the Native Americans in North America were only hunter-gatherers prior to the arrival of these crops, that when these crops got here, they were so awesome that the Native Americans just adopted them right away, abandoned foraging and hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and just became agriculturalists, became Mississippians, built the big cities, and did what they did. So, there's that like miracle from the South kind of thing. And actually, you see this in like the 19th century name Aztlan for the site in Jefferson County is actually the ancient Aztec homeland, right? It was part of that mound builder myth that the Aztecs are somehow involved with this site because they have to be, obviously, duh, because or Wisconsin Indians couldn't possibly have built this. That's ridiculous. But it turns out that there's, we talk about the development of agriculture, and we know that it was first developed in the Fertile Crescent region of Mesopotamia and Egypt. And the earliest domestication was at about 9,500 BC. So we have Immer and einkorn wheat, followed in close succession by barley, legumes, and flax. And that is absolutely is the earliest domestication, is about 9,500 BC, and probably actually had more to do with wanting to make more beer than wanting to make bread initially. You are harvesting wild grains, leaving them out in maybe like a bowl overnight, and they get wet, they get rained on, and they start to ferment. You're like, well, we can't let this go to waste. You try it anyway, and all of a sudden, you've discovered beer. Most of these things do happen on accident. And then you decide you want to try planting these again so that you can ensure that you have more of this wonderful concoction later on. Other locuses of domestication that get talked about, you have in China, rice and millet are domesticated at about 8,000 BC. The Sahel in Africa, rice, sorghum are domesticated about 5,000 BC. In the Andes, you have potatoes at about 5,000 years ago. And in Mesoamerica, in the Teotihuacan Valley, you have maize being domesticated at about 5,000 BC. So this is, when I'm taking Archaeology 101, this is what they tell me. These are the 5 places where domestication happened. And, for some reason, North America is not mentioned. But it turns out that North America is an independent locus of domestication. And, just to start with, and I'll track back a little bit. So these Three Sisters crops that are assumed to be Mesoamerican arrivals, the squash is probably my favorite story. It was long assumed that squash came up from Mexico, that it's got to be a tropical cultigen. And, there is a species of squash, Cucurbita mixta, that is from Mexico, that is among the summer squash that we grow today in our gardens. But the main species of squash that we grow is actually Cucurbita pepo, which is includes such lovely plants as pumpkin and zucchini. Turns out that it's actually a native North American plant. It's a common agricultural weed today in the Southeast. And there's evidence for wild versions of this from about 5,000 years ago in eastern Kentucky, rock shelters. Rock shelters are really, really great for plant preservation. They're dry environments. You don't even have to have the stuff be burned. It'll just preserve. And So there's evidence that early that people were exploiting the wild plant. Now, wild squash is really more of a gourd, and it kind of is egg-shaped, very, very hard rind, very, very large bitter seeds, so they probably weren't eating it. They were probably using it as a container. I mean, you still, have like birdhouse gourds and bottle gourds today. You dry them out. They're very, very durable, and it's a lot easier to just dry out a gourd for like a drinking cup or something than it is to make a pot for that. Especially, 5,000 years ago, they didn't really have pottery yet. So this is like a pre-pottery sort of container. And actually, that's probably the kind of plant that originally was domesticated. Just like in Mesopotamia and the Fertile Crescent, you have beer probably being the reason for domestication, which is not necessary for survival, as much as we Milwaukeeans might like to disagree with that idea. You don't need beer to live. Beer is a novelty, and so you're starting to plant near your settlements or near somewhere where you're going to come back to something that you would like to have but don't necessarily need to have. Just like when, as gardeners now, we don't plant, usually corn or rice or the things we need to eat on a regular basis to survive. We plant things that we think are tasty, like tomatoes and strawberries, stuff that tastes really good when it comes from the garden. So, that's one thing. Tobacco was probably an early domesticate in Mesoamerica for that reason. It's nice to have it, you want it around, but you're not depending on it for your survival. So this gourd probably starts to be planted for the container properties. One of the things that when we study ancient diet choice, we talk about risk management, and it's essentially an economic model that says that you make your choices based on the risk versus reward of acquiring a certain resource. So to start out by planting a food crop and putting all of your time and energy into that with no guarantee of return on harvest, if you're not used to agriculture and you don't know the rules, is really dangerous and really risky. So that's why you're going to start out with something that's more just like useful but not strictly necessary. So you do have domesticated squash in eastern United States about 3,000 years ago. And how we know that is by the rind thickness. You just basically measure it using the microscope. You adjust for carbonization if it's burned. And as it gets thinner, you know that it's getting domesticated, essentially. And you can do experimental work on this with a few generations. You can modify plants fairly quickly. They're very genetically malleable. So, and another mechanism of domestication that happens is as a weedy camp follower. So I mentioned that this particular gourd is an agricultural weed today. And oftentimes that's what happens. You're using something, you throw it in your trash pile, and then it grows where you're living. And the particular individuals, and this is like natural selection type stuff, that you're using are the ones that you're throwing in your trash pile. So you're going to be using the ones with bigger seeds that are easier to use, and then that's what's going to end up growing near you. Does that make sense?
I think so. And I mean, in the context of like teaching have done of for undergrads into the survey course of it, I mean, does this become like a hurdle? Like people have other like different or like stranger notions of the domestication process works? Or
yeah, well, I think the general notion of domestication is that it's a very deliberate process. You think like, I am going to plant this now, and I'm going to grow it. But it's really, at least initially, probably is accidental. I accidentally grew potatoes this year. They grew in the compost pile. Yeah. Well, potatoes are easy to grow. But, it's that, and then you might as well eat the stuff that's growing around your camp. And then over time, you're selecting for the ones that you're using. But, the same thing happens with animals, really, is especially cats and dogs. Cats are domesticated in Egypt, probably. They start hanging around the granary of their own volition at first. They're like, oh, these grain stores are full of rodents. That's cool. And then over time, the ones that are cute and cuddly and nicer get picked up probably by kids, and they're fed and they're petted, and over time they become domesticated. So it's this mutual process. And the same thing with plants. It's a mutual process, which I know it's hard to think of plants as something that can participate in a process, but...
Yeah, and also the other side of that would be that, communities are altering, forming at a different scale because of this, so that, it seemed that it's a form of domesticating other people, or
right.
at least reworking them. So it doesn't seem that the common knowledge of, it would be useful if we had control over this, this plant. If we had control over this animal consistently, seems like entirely backward of it, since the end result is
right. Well, and I think that notion of how domestication comes about has its roots in the idea that we are separate from nature and in control of it. Whereas really it's a biofeedback loop, essentially. Another really good example, not of domestication, but of management. We have this idea of the myth of the noble savage, that the Indian never harmed the earth and left her unchanged and lived at peace and in harmony. And, true to an extent, certainly a much more sustainable lifestyle than we have. But absolutely Native Americans are modifying their environment and vice versa. So a really good example would be, we have a particular vegetational community, which is what we call like a group of plants that tend to grow together, in Wisconsin called the oak opening. And these are like an oak savanna with, a few dozen trees over a square mile. Not really thick forest, lots of room to move around. And it turns out that this is really good deer hunting habitat, because you can see the deer, but the deer feel confident enough that they can run from tree to tree, that they're going to be there. It's like an edge environment. And so there's significant evidence that prehistoric groups actually created these savannas deliberately by setting fire to the forest undergrowth. Because in about 10 years, the forest undergrowth will start to take back over unless it burns. And just the scale of oak savanna that was here at the time of the General Land Office survey in the 19th century could not be explained solely by natural prairie fires. So there's that idea. Well, it turns out also that oak openings have about the perfect soil for agriculture. So, having that pre-existing environment that was suitable for deer hunting when people are foragers turns out to also be suitable for agriculture once those ideas start to get developed and arrive and encourage agriculture. So it is that sort of endless feedback loop that things develop together. So,
kind of connected with that, wonder as like the larger assumptions or myths again that people have about civilization as a whole. We already mentioned that in part in the context of that arguably it was a there's a lot of indications that if it makes people more exploited, have less time, which are doing more work, that it's, I guess, more problematic when that would at basis assume. Since we're all coming at this from own context and and the type of culture that tends to just assume a lot of things like agrarian civilization are a unqualified good. I guess wondering if that informs other kind of myths in more specific ways.
Well, I think it definitely, with the erasure of the Native American prehistory from our cultural landscape, has to do with this idea that the land was put under the plow and tamed, which was a good thing by Europeans, and literal erasure of the prehistory in a lot of cases, because you have effigy mounds, which there used to be thousands of them in the state of Wisconsin. We have maps made in the 19th century that prove that, but now there are hundreds. And the city of Milwaukee itself used to have hundreds, and now there are 2 within Milwaukee County, one in Lake Park and one on the state fairgrounds. So it's, a literal erasure of this presence from the landscape by civilization. And when we talk, civilization refers to the city. That's the word city and civilization have the same root. And a city is something that has to take resources from outside of itself. It can't produce all of its resources within its bounds. If you talk about early cities like Ur in Mesopotamia, you're always going to have exterior settlements. Cahokia in southern Illinois had exterior settlements because they could not grow all the corn they needed and other plants they needed for 10,000 people within the city limits, as it were. It had to come from elsewhere in the American bottom. And so you're always going to have this essentially exploitative relationship where somebody's giving you grain or whatever in exchange for ostensibly protection. But who are they protecting you against if not themselves, essentially? So it's, again, sort of a feedback loop, but you create the threat of force and then protect them from it, essentially. the legitimate monopoly on forest rape. So
yeah, which I mean seems a very common pattern for how groups consolidate themselves. I mean,
right.
to form awareness of themselves as something that is, in terms of collectively sort of rule that is defined through the, real or perceived threat
right.
of outsiders, which kind of weird loops around. I mean, I wonder in terms of like discussion of like gender and in terms of family structures and family rules, since I mentioned previously in the context of what was perhaps in terms of ritualized decapitation of
right.
women in the context. I mean,
that's something that at least in North America is really, really hard to parse out. Archaeologically, because it's obviously you find male and female burials, but for the most part, actually, they're fairly similar, except for those rare exceptions, like Mound 72 at Cahokia, where you have the 2 young men and the 50 decapitated women. But for the most part, they are, especially in like Lake Woodland, Wisconsin, treated the same. Everybody is treated the same in burials in Lake Woodland, Wisconsin. They're buried in the mound with very simple grave goods. So probably the late Woodland groups were not yet so socially stratified as the later Mississippian groups were, or contemporaneous Mississippian groups were, probably more egalitarian. And one of the ways that we get at social status in the archaeological record is by like quantity and level of grave goods. That's perhaps the only way to get at it, really.
Yeah, I guess I was going to ask in that context. I mean, that in terms of absence, like the ritualized area where there's like different kinds of roles or different kinds of like placements or treatments or priority. I mean,
sure.
are there other ways of reading like power structures or things
right.
at that kind of remove?
It's hard. And let's say with Cahokia, we assume there were structures on top of Monk's Mound, and you can see that archaeologically by darkened soil. We assume that perhaps that was an elite residence or a temple, but there's really no conclusive way of knowing that. And at Aztalan, it's particularly troublesome because there are 2 extant mounds, one of which, the Northwest Mound, had burials in it. And so that's where you assume that the elites would be buried. Well, there are people buried there, and they are different from the people who are found. Well, there aren't a lot of burials in other areas of the site, except maybe chopped up in little pieces in the trash pit, but that again might be an artifact of warfare. The individuals in the mound, some of them do have isotope signatures that suggest they're from the Mississippi River Valley and therefore probably the American Bottom, but some of them are also local. And they're not buried with very elaborate grave goods. In fact, the only grave goods in the particular burial that I'm talking about is a seed jar and some hickory nuts, really. So like it's not the elaborate, like at Cahokia and Mound 72 you get just piles of projectile points and pottery and these elaborate blankets made of shell beads. Not the case at Aztalan. So I don't know if that's because, we don't know if that's because it was an impoverished settlement and that's what they could put in there. That doesn't seem to be the case because we find much more elaborate vessels and copper pieces and stuff at other areas of the site, or if there was something else going on there that we just don't understand. So, you want to talk about these. One wants to talk about structural inequalities and social structure. It's very, very hard to extrapolate that archaeologically. We have the built environment, and this is kind of an issue regarding the lack of communication between cultural anthropologists and archaeologists. Cultural anthropologists study structural inequalities all the time, but they don't study material culture and they don't study the built environment. So they're always talking about communication and things of that nature, but none of that stuff is visible archaeologically. So we can't use data from cultural anthropology studies of like what structural inequalities look like physically, because it doesn't exist. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think it would. I mean,
they're not like focusing on the way like a built environment is constructed to create inequality, but that's what we have to look at. Not only do we just have the built environment, we have the bottom of it. We have like the houses with all the roofs sawn off, just the foundations essentially. It would be like walking into your living room and the TV stand is like a stain on the carpet and you've got to try to figure out what the heck that is, what do you even do with that? So we're always stabbing around in the dark to an extent, but I think it's important that we continue to do it because it's the only way these stories are going to be told about what happened on this landscape before Europeans got here. So.
Yeah, and I guess I'm pushing towards any other zone of invisibility, and I mean, yeah, I guess. I mean, maybe like a follow-up thing that came before, like even in terms of contemporary times, or like in the 1930s, that there are, can be specific, unique things that would otherwise not have been apparent that archaeological methods are useful for. I mean, I guess there are other kinds of like gaps or.
Sure. Well, I mean, when we talk about underrepresented groups, we can talk about women. If you want to talk about the role of women in like frontier settlements or logging camps or mining camps, I was privileged to work on an artifact collection from a mining camp in Depression-era Minnesota. And you find a lot of the things that you expect to find at a mining camp. Lots of icky debris. Historic sites can be a lot more disgusting than prehistoric ones because all the gross stuff hasn't decayed yet. You find mining equipment. You find Vaseline jars, which are used to like coat your hands after you've been working. But I also got to look at a bead from an elaborate like 1920s snake bracelet, like a Cleopatra-style snake bracelet. And what that is probably evidence of a prostitute or lady of the night visiting the mining camp. And so you can see the activities of women, which are obviously not going to be talked about in the official records. You're not going to talk about prostitutes, but yet there they are. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. It becomes useful because specific texts are like never going to be like ideologically neutral, and even the decision to optimize or focus on them more isn't going to be. Isn't like neutral or objective or inherently necessarily even always the best way of regarding things that were happening. I mean, it gives context usefully, but I mean, particularly if in situations where, well, I mean, I'm reminded of the many groups of in terms of Catholic heresies, of which we have best single record is the Inquisition, it's the people that executed them for it, or I mean, survey of dissident groups that are in terms of police become the default one since they were successful enough in crushing them. I mean, I think it seems like generalize somewhat more towards, either whether it's in terms of uncouth behavior or just or not tolerated social norms or entire races or genders of it that are not regarded with or not have capabilities or autonomy to articulate their own narratives.
And unfortunately, the archaeological data are not neutral either. Just as I talked about it at the beginning with the mound builder myth, we're always socially embedded. And I could, briefly talk about another case study. I was talking about the squash, and I could, the thing you mentioned was corn. And here's this idea again that we have the crops coming up from Mesoamerica that must have been so great and so much better than anything that they had. And we've long thought, and still, I read texts written fairly recently for archaeologists that assume that corn is the most important thing for the Mississippian way of life. And it does show up in the Midwest as early as the Middle Woodland, which dates from about 1000 BC to about 580. You start to see corn, but it's very, very, very small. And there's a culture called the Hopewell in both Ohio and Illinois and surrounding states that built mounds, the famous Serpent Mound in Ohio, and very elaborate grave goods like mica hands and huge points made of quartz and just really cool stuff, antler headdresses. That was assumed to be a very elaborate society, large trade routes, Gulf Coast shells and copper from the Great Lakes, just stuff from all over. So the assumption was for many, many years that maize had to have been the driving factor. There's no way you could have such a complex society without something like maize to support an elite, right? As we talk about, you need a surplus, perhaps, to support an elite. But when we actually look at the floral data, there is hardly any maize, and a lot of that is probably intrusive from later contexts. So what were they doing? Well, it turns out that they were growing native cultigens, again, like squash that I already mentioned, but there are also a suite of plants called the Eastern Agricultural Complex, which are weeds. Essentially, we would think of them as weeds. If you're a gardener, you've probably heard of lamb's quarters or goosefoot. Chenopodium, that was domesticated as a seed crop. And there are rock shelters in like eastern in the Ozarks. The Marble Bluff rock shelter, which dates to about 3,000 years ago, has found Chenopodium lamb's quarters with a very thin seed coat, which is evidence for domestication. And there's this whole suite of plants. You've got squash, sumpweed, sunflower, little barley, Chenopodium, that are, we would look at them and we would think they were weeds today, but they were clearly very economically important, and they continued to be economically important even up through the Middle Mississippian period, this time period where we assume maize agriculture is at its height. Actually, some of the most famous figurines that people always cite as evidence for maize agriculture, even archaeologists say, like, look, she's hoeing the ground in this figurine to ready it for planting the maize. Well, the only plant represented on this figurine is squash. There is no maize on this figurine. So it's just these assumptions carry through, even archaeologists do it, and it's always important to sort of try to step back and look at our own assumptions.
Yeah, or at least recognize the degree of humility of it, that we're not just simply studying the like myths or rituals of other groups of societies, but we're still being motivated by our own in terms of what we see and don't see among that. I think unfortunately that comes to the time of it. But I'd like to thank you very much for joining me. It's an interesting topic and range, and like this sort of methodology. And think by the same token, if we're just talking about, it's useful to cross disciplines and see, I guess, the differing kinds of questions and approaches that are being brought forth. So thank you very much for having me. And thanks for tuning in, and be sure to join us again next week, where I will be arguing against electoral democracy and in general, and our current bipartisan situation, and both political parties in particular. This has been another episode of Size of Thoughts.